Okay, so we've got our bunch of dead bodies here, but let's make it more interesting and add some explosives and some flying bits of robot pieces all over the place. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is create an actual explosion within our world. So what we're going to use is these little explosion objects, where they're just two basic circles, but they will work very effectively as a simple little explosion. So I'm just going to drag this little black one in here first, and all we're going to do is create a simple little animation and add an explosive sound effect, much like we did with our impact effect, and it'll very effectively create a simple explosion and look good within our world. So we have our black disc here. Next thing we're going to do is go to our audio and drop in our explosion sound effect onto there, and then we're going to, much as we did with the impact of the bullets, create an explosion animation. So we'll go into our animation folder, we'll call this explosion, and we'll go to just 2 frames in here and switch our explosion black for a white one, and 2 frames more and switch it to be none so that it will disappear, and then we'll jump on to 1 second and switch it between the two so it's back to none again, and it's completely disappeared. So we can see it just flashes for a second, which is just quick enough to register it, and with the sound effect it'll sound like an actual explosion. So we're going to also apply our destroy over time script again to this. So we're going to add component destroy over time and give it a lifetime of half a second, much as we did. Actually, make it a little bit longer, make it 0.75 just with the explosion sound effect, and we'll do the same thing to test it out as we did before. So I'm going to deactivate the object first, and then we'll activate it within the world just to test it out. So our explosion, there we go. It's very quick, but it works nicely for what we want it to do. Again, if you feel like it's a little bit too quick, we could always move these on a little bit like that, so the explosion lasts a tiny bit longer, but still survives within our world. Okay, so we've got our explosion effect, nice and simple to make. I'm going to reactivate it again, just so we can create it as... Oh, we need to disable our animation. To make sure, yeah, there's not weird going on there for a second. So we want to disable our animation, and then we want to drop that into our prefabs folder. So we have our explosion made, and we're going to delete it from our scene. So obviously we're going to need to make that explosion be created whenever our robots are destroyed. So let's do that first of all. Go into our script. We'll obviously need a reference to that explosion even, if I could say words. So we'll say a public game object that we'll call explosion, and basically all we want is whenever our enemies get killed, we'll make an explosion appear. So just down here we're going to say instantiate our explosion at wherever our current robot is. So transform.position and transform.rotation, like that. And that's all we have to do to make our explosion work. Obviously we need to hook it up with our robot here, so we'll let that compile, and then on our robot, once that compiles, we'll go down to our health script, and we're just going to drag our explosion into there, and then we'll see when we hit play, whenever we kill an enemy. Oh well, we didn't apply that change to all of them, did we? Apply that. So there we go, we got a nice little sound effect when we kill all the enemies. You can just hear it there. So you can see we're actually doing a little bit more damage to our enemies now. So even without doing the little body pieces bit, it's kind of looking a bit more interesting. We can actually see there that our explosion was appearing behind our enemies, which isn't what we want. So on our explosion object, I'm actually just going to rename that to be just explosion rather than explosion black, because that is just the name of the the sprite image, so we just want it to be explosion. But we're actually going to set the sorting layer to be enemy. We want to make sure it's in front of the enemy, so all the different pieces of the enemies are in different positions on our sorting layer here. So for example, our arm at the front is at 2, our leg at the front is at 1, so the highest number is 2, so we want to make sure that our explosion appears in front of all those pieces. So on our enemy layer we'll just set this to be really high. We'll just set it to be 100, so it always appears in front of the enemies, just the way we want it to. Okay, so now that we have that in place, we want to actually make the different pieces of the robot fall around in the world. And the way we can do that is just by attaching a rigid body to each piece of the robot, and then attaching a collider to each piece as well, so that each piece has its own physicality within the world, and then it can fly off wherever it wants to. So what we'll do is just highlight all the different pieces of our robot here, and we're just going to go to add component, and we're going to add a box collider 2D to each component, and we're also going to add a rigid body 2D. Now by default the boxes will be quite big, so you're obviously free to go through each box and say, for example, with the head here, it doesn't need to be right up to the antenna, so we could shrink the size of this box in a little bit and down a bit. We could move the Y value down to there, so you could go through each piece and fiddle around with it as you want to, but I'm not going to dive into doing too much of that at the moment, because it's still going to look interesting even without doing that. So now that we've added that to all of those, we're going to apply those changes to the robot. So we can see if we hit apply on any of these sub objects, it's still going to apply to all the pieces. The next thing we want to do is on each of these pieces, we want to go to our rigid body and set is kinematic to be true. And the reason we do that is because if we don't, all the pieces will automatically, as soon as the game is running, all the pieces will fall down to the ground. We'll be left with the robot holder object that is in the world. That'll still move around, but all the little pieces will just fall down. Just as an example, if we hit play here, we'll see this in action. Did I actually hit is kinematic? I did. So I hit is kinematic on this guy, but all the other robots that were being created, all those pieces didn't have his kinematic, so they just fell down to the ground, which is obviously not what we want to happen at all. So what we'll do is highlight all these. As I said, we have them all set to is kinematic, and one other thing we're going to do is actually set them all to be on the dead layer. We'll say yes, the change color doesn't matter too much because we're still just changing all these pieces, and the reason we want to do that is because we don't want any of those pieces interacting with each other anyway, and they're only going to actually have any kind of effect when they are exploding around the world. They're not actually going to do anything unless they're exploding around like that. So now that we have that done, we're going to go to our robot again. We'll apply all those changes, and now we have all those pieces that are, because they're kinematic, they're being removed around by the animator and by the object that is a parent of them. So if we hit play again, basically it looks back to being the exact same as it was before we did any of that. But now that we have those things attached, as soon as we die, we can just loop through all those parts and give them a force and give them some spin like we did with the body and make them go flying around all over the place with a little bit of fun. So let's start adding that in here now. So we obviously need a reference to all those different body pieces for our enemy. So we can say public, they're all rigid bodies that we're dealing with. So it'll be public rigid body 2D. We'll create an array of that, and we'll call this we'll just call it rigid body parts. So as I said, we're going to make them spin around, so we'll use the same spin force that we used, our death spin here. We'll use the same spin force that we used for our holder object. We'll apply that here, but we're also going to apply a public float explosion force. So this is going to be a new force that'll make the body pieces go flying around within the world. So when we want that to happen is obviously after after all our body parts are changed into the broken version, and after an explosion happens, right after we do that, we can set all the rigid body parts to fly around within our world. So we're going to loop through an array, not an array, but the array of our rigid body pieces. So again, for int I starting out as 0, as long as I is less than the rigid body parts array dot length, so the length of that, then we will keep, as long as I is less, we'll keep making I go up. And on every loop through, we're going to say, okay, on each part, so on each rigid body parts I, we want to set the is kinematic value to be equal to false. So then, as we saw, if we just go back and scroll down to our rigid body, so let's go to one of these. So we have is kinematic as true, and as we saw, when is kinematic was left as false, all those pieces fell down onto the world. So basically, when is kinematic is false, it means that we're actively using our various physics on it. So now that is kinematic is false, they all have gravity and can be interacted with. So let's apply our spin to them. So each part, we're going to say rigid body parts I. We're going to add torque, much like we did before. We're just going to add our death spin. It doesn't really matter which way the body is facing when we add our death spin now, because they're just going to fly off anyway. And then to each part, we want to give it some velocity. So we'll say rigid body parts dot velocity is equal to a new vector 2, and we want each part to fly off differently. We don't want them all to go the exact same way or anything like that. So for the x and the y values, we're going to pick some random numbers. So for the x value, we're going to say random dot range between minus explosion force and just explosion force, so plus explosion force. So it'll pick a random number, say our explosion force is 10, it'll pick a random number between minus 10 and 10, and it'll apply that on the x-axis, and we'll do the exact same thing on the y-axis. So now our little body parts will fly off in different directions, just the way we want. We'll hit our semicolon there at the end. And that's pretty much it. That's all we want to do. That's how we'll affect our different rigid bodies. So let's go back in here. So we've created that array of rigid body pieces, so we're going to need to apply that on our enemy health manager down here. Oh, we have an error I just noticed. What is our error on line 59? Oh, I didn't close that bracket. That was why we closed this bracket here, but we had to make sure that we also closed this open bracket here. So we'll save that again, go back in here, let it compile, and we'll get our little array appearing here and our value for our explosive force as well. So our explosion force, let's just set that to be 10 for now. And then once again, I'm going to lock this so that we can highlight all the other pieces and just click and drag them on top of rigid body parts, and we can see now we have all 6 of them in there. We'll unlock that and then go back to our robot, and we're going to apply these changes. And now when we hit play here, we should see, as soon as we kill an enemy, there we go, all the different body pieces now go flying out, and we're left with a whole bunch of debris around us here. Let's just maximize the screen here. I'm going to reset. And you can see all the different pieces go flying around. So we could also, as always with any of this stuff, it's fun to mess around with the values and see what comes out. So let's just go a little bit crazy and put this up to 100. We'll apply that to all of the robots here. We'll hit play. And we can see the body parts go flying out quite quickly when we do that. So we end up with lots of various different parts all over the place. Heads stuck in the ground and such things like that, which is a little bit weird looking, but that's just because we applied so much force to all the various pieces. But as you can see, it's more interesting now. We've got all our little bits of enemies around the place. Let's go back to our robot and actually decrease that because that's a little bit too crazy. Let's just reset our scene again. So once again, now we have all the broken parts lying on the ground. If we go off, continuing our adventure, wherever you want to go, we go off down this corridor, and we come back, and there's all these different body parts lying around the room. It's more interesting. You've got a little bit of a story in your own head without any story within the game being told. But as I said, you come back to this area and you're like, oh, look at all these different body parts lying around. That's all those robots I killed. It's fun, it's interesting, and it adds that little bit of extra impact to your game without actually impacting the performance of the game itself in any kind of real adverse way.